2013, Beijing, China. President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. $1 trillion, 150 countries, railways across Asia, ports in Africa, roads through Europe. China was building an empire. Not through military conquest, through debt, infrastructure, and economic influence. The modern Silk Road. China at the center. The world connected to Beijing. 2025, 12 years later. Pakistan owes China $30 billion it cannot repay. Sri Lanka surrendered its strategic port to Chinese control. Dozens of countries trapped in debt they'll never escape. China's empire is cracking, and the pattern looks terrifyingly familiar. 1945, London, Britain. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land, 500 million subjects, the largest empire in human history. 20 years later, almost all of it was gone. India independent, Africa decolonized. The empire dissolved faster than anyone thought possible. What destroyed the British Empire? Not military defeat, not rebellion alone. Economics. Today, China faces the same contradictions that destroyed Britain. Massive debt financing imperial expansion, infrastructure projects that lose money, strategic overextension across continents, rising nationalism in client states, economic slowdown at home making empire unaffordable. China's Belt and Road Initiative looks like the British Empire in the 1940s. Vast, impressive, unsustainable. The question isn't whether China is building an empire. It obviously is. The question is, will it collapse the same way Britain's did? Will China repeat history's most expensive mistake? Or has China learned from Britain's failure? This is the story of two empires, one dead, one dying. The patterns are identical. The ending might be too. This isn't anti-China propaganda. This isn't pro-Western bias. This is economic history repeating itself. Empires that cost more than they generate always collapse. Always. Rome, Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. Is China next? Will China's empire collapse the same way Britain's did? Let's examine the evidence. To understand if China will collapse like Britain, we first need to understand how Britain built its empire and why it fell. 1920, the British Empire at its peak. 458 million people under British rule, territories on every continent, control of global trade routes, the pound sterling as world reserve currency, the Royal Navy ruling the seas. Britain didn't conquer this empire for glory. Britain built it for profit. Economic motives, raw materials from colonies, captive markets for British manufactured goods, investment opportunities for British capital. The empire was supposed to make Britain rich. For a while, it did. India provided cotton, tea, opium. Africa provided gold, diamonds, copper. The Caribbean provided sugar. Australia provided wool and wheat. Raw materials flowed to Britain. British manufactured goods flowed back. Profit accumulated in London. The empire seemed sustainable. But empires have costs. Military forces stationed across the world, naval bases in every ocean, administrative systems governing millions, infrastructure, railways, ports, telegraphs, built at British expense. By 1900, the costs were rising faster than the profits. Colonies demanded more investment. Nationalist movements required military suppression. Competing powers, Germany, America, Japan, challenged British dominance. The empire was becoming a burden. World War I made it worse. Britain borrowed massively to fight Germany, sold overseas assets, went into debt to America. By 1918, Britain was financially exhausted. But it still had the empire. In fact, the empire was larger than ever. Britain gained German colonies and Ottoman territories. More territory, more costs, less ability to pay.
World War II broke the system completely. 6 years of total war, massive borrowing, asset liquidation, dependence on American loans. By 1945, Britain was bankrupt. Debt over 250% of GDP, currency reserves depleted, unable to feed its own population without American aid. And the empire? Now completely unaffordable. India cost more to administer than it generated in revenue. Africa required constant military presence. The Middle East was exploding with nationalist movements. Britain faced a choice: maintain the empire and go completely bankrupt, or abandon the empire and survive. Britain chose survival. 1947, India independent. 1948, Burma, Ceylon independent. 1957, Ghana independent. 1960s, most of Africa independent. 20 years, the entire empire gone. Not because of military defeat, because of economics. The empire cost more than Britain could afford.
Let's summarize why the British Empire collapsed. First, economic exhaustion from 2 world wars. Second, massive debt Britain couldn't repay. Third, empire maintenance costs exceeding colonial revenues. Fourth, rising nationalism in colonies, making control expensive. Fifth, American pressure to decolonize. Sixth, democratic accountability. British voters demanded domestic spending, not colonial wars. Seventh, strategic pivot. Britain chose American alliance over empire. None of these were military defeats. All were economic failures. The empire didn't fall to enemies. It collapsed under its own weight. Britain couldn't afford empire anymore. Simple as that. Now, let's look at China today. The parallels are stunning. 2013, Xi Jinping unveiled the Belt and Road Initiative. The official goal? Connectivity, infrastructure development, mutual prosperity. The real goal? Chinese influence across Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. A modern empire built on debt, not conquest. The Belt and Road Initiative spans 150-plus countries, over $1 trillion committed. Railways, ports, highways, power plants, telecommunications networks. All financed by Chinese loans, all built by Chinese companies, all creating dependency on China. This is empire building, not with soldiers, with infrastructure and debt. Pakistan, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, $62 billion in Chinese investment. Sri Lanka, Hambantota Port, built with Chinese loans, handed to China when Sri Lanka couldn't repay. Kenya, Standard Gauge Railway, $5 billion borrowed from China. Dozens more across Africa, Asia, Latin America, even Europe. China is doing what Britain did, investing globally to create economic dependencies. But there's a problem. Many of these projects don't make economic sense. Railways that carry too little cargo to repay loans, ports in locations without sufficient trade, power plants that generate electricity nobody can afford. These aren't profitable investments. They're strategic deployments. China isn't building Belt and Road for profit. China is building it for influence. Just like Britain built railways in India, not because they were profitable, but because they facilitated control. And just like Britain, China is discovering that empire is expensive. Sri Lanka couldn't repay its port loan. China took ownership, a 99-year lease. Pakistan is drowning in Chinese debt, over $30 billion owed, no way to repay. Malaysia canceled Chinese projects worth $22 billion. Too expensive, too much debt. Myanmar canceled the Myitsone Dam. Local opposition,
Chinese overreach. Country after country is realizing Chinese investment comes with strings attached.
And resistance is growing. In Pakistan, protests against Chinese influence. Baloch separatists attacking Chinese projects. In Myanmar, ethnic armies opposing Chinese investments. In Africa, rising resentment of Chinese labor practices, environmental damage, debt burdens. This is exactly what Britain faced in the 1940s, 50s. Colonies that once welcomed British investment turned against it. Nationalist movements demanded independence. Economic benefits weren't worth political subordination. China is facing the same backlash. Belt and Road was supposed to create loyal client states. Instead, it's creating resentment. Why? Because infrastructure built to serve Chinese interests doesn't necessarily serve local interests. Because debt creates dependency, and nobody likes being dependent. Because Chinese companies bring Chinese workers, limiting local employment. Because projects often benefit Chinese exports more than local economies. The same problems that destroyed British imperial economics. But China's biggest problem isn't foreign resistance. It's domestic economic crisis. China's economy is slowing dramatically, GDP growth falling, from double digits to barely 5%. Real growth possibly much lower. Demographics collapsing, population declining, aging rapidly, fewer workers supporting more retirees. Debt exploding. Total debt over 300% of GDP. Local governments bankrupt. Property sector collapsing. Youth unemployment over 20%. College graduates can't find jobs. This is Britain in the 1940s, an economy exhausted, unable to sustain imperial commitments. And just like Britain, China faces a choice. Maintain Belt and Road, spending billions on foreign infrastructure while the domestic economy struggles. Or prioritize domestic needs, cutting foreign spending to address internal problems. China is already pulling back. Lending for Belt and Road projects has dropped sharply since 2019, from $75 billion annually to under $5 billion. China is quietly retreating, just like Britain did. Let's compare Britain's imperial collapse with China's situation today. Britain in 1945, debt over 250% of GDP. Currency under pressure, unable to fund both empire and domestic needs, forced to choose survival over empire. China in 2025, debt over 300% of GDP. Currency under pressure, capital flight, yuan depreciation concerns, unable to fund both Belt and Road and domestic needs, forced to choose domestic stability over foreign influence. The parallel is exact. Britain borrowed to build and maintain empire. The debt became unsustainable. Britain abandoned empire to survive. China is borrowing to build Belt and Road. The debt is becoming unsustainable. China is quietly abandoning projects. History repeating. Britain's imperial model: extract raw materials from colonies, manufacture goods in Britain, sell back to colonies. Profit accumulates in London. China's Belt and Road model: loan money to developing countries, build infrastructure with Chinese companies, export Chinese goods through that infrastructure. Profit accumulates in Beijing. Both models have the same fatal flaw. They require the imperial center to remain economically strong. When Britain's economy weakened, the entire imperial system collapsed. When China's economy weakens, the Belt and Road system is collapsing. Why? Because empire is expensive. It only works if the center can afford it. Britain in 1945 couldn't afford empire anymore. The costs exceeded any possible benefit. China in 2025 is reaching the same point. Belt and Road costs exceed returns. And unlike Britain, China faces even worse demographics and debt. Britain faced rising nationalism in colonies. India, Quit India movement, civil disobedience. Kenya, Mau Mau uprising. Malaya, communist insurgency. Egypt,
Nationalist protests. Every colony demanded independence. Britain couldn't suppress them all. Fighting cost too much. Britain let them go. China faces rising nationalism in Belt and Road countries. Pakistan, anti-Chinese protests, attacks on projects. Myanmar, ethnic resistance to Chinese investments. Kazakhstan, anti-Chinese sentiment growing. Zambia, protests against Chinese mining companies. Every client state is questioning Chinese influence. China could suppress resistance with force, but that would cost billions. And China, like Britain, can't afford expensive colonial wars while facing domestic economic crisis. So China is doing what Britain did, quietly withdrawing, cutting lending, abandoning unprofitable projects, retreating to core interests. The empire is shrinking.
Britain faced American pressure to decolonize. America opposed British imperialism, used financial leverage, loans, aid, to force Britain to grant independence to colonies. Britain, dependent on American support, complied. China faces American pressure to retreat from Belt and Road. America opposes Chinese expansion, uses financial weapons, sanctions, investment restrictions, pressure on allies. China, facing American financial and technological pressure, is complying. The pattern repeats. Both Britain and China discovered you can't maintain empire while economically dependent on a rival power that opposes your empire. Britain needed America's financial support more than it needed colonies. China needs access to Western markets and technology more than it needs Belt and Road. So both empires contracted under pressure.
Britain was a democracy. British voters demanded spending on domestic needs, not colonies. After World War II, voters wanted housing, healthcare, jobs, not colonial wars. Politicians who promised domestic investment won elections. Those defending empire lost. Democracy accelerated decolonization. China is authoritarian. No elections, no democratic accountability. But China has a different kind of accountability, performance legitimacy. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy depends on delivering economic growth and rising living standards. When the economy thrives, the party is secure. When the economy struggles, the party's legitimacy erodes. Right now, China's economy is struggling. Young people can't find jobs. The property sector is collapsing. Local governments are broke. Chinese citizens are questioning why their government spends billions on foreign infrastructure while domestic problems multiply. Social media complaints about Belt and Road waste, online criticism of foreign aid while Chinese suffer. The party is listening, and like British politicians, Chinese leaders are choosing domestic stability over imperial ambitions.
So, will China's empire collapse the same way Britain's did? The evidence suggests yes, it's already happening. Belt and Road lending has collapsed from $75 billion annually to under $5 billion. China is abandoning unprofitable projects. Malaysia, Myanmar, others canceling or renegotiating. Debt restructuring negotiations everywhere. Countries can't repay. China forced to write off loans. Strategic retreat. China pulling back from Africa, Central Asia, even Pakistan. This is exactly what Britain did in 1945-1965. Rapid withdrawal from untenable imperial commitments. Prioritizing domestic survival over foreign influence. Accepting loss of prestige to avoid economic collapse. China isn't collapsing militarily. China is collapsing economically. The empire is being abandoned for the same reason Britain abandoned its empire. It costs too much. But there are important differences between Britain and China. Britain's empire was formal, political control, direct administration. China's empire is informal, economic influence, debt dependency. This makes Chinese retreat easier. Britain had to negotiate independence, transfer power, withdraw administrations. China just stops lending money, lets projects fail, walks away.
No dramatic independence ceremonies, no decolonization crisis, just quiet economic retreat. Second difference, Britain was democratic. Public pressure accelerated withdrawal. China is authoritarian. The party can resist public pressure longer. But as we've seen, even authoritarian regimes face accountability. Performance legitimacy matters. Economic failure threatens the party. So China will retreat, maybe more slowly than Britain, but just as surely.
China has some advantages Britain lacked. China's economy is more diversified than Britain's was. China has massive foreign exchange reserves. Britain ran out in 1947. China controls its currency. Britain's pound was under constant speculative attack. China has nuclear weapons. Britain had them, but couldn't use them to maintain empire. These advantages might slow China's retreat, but they can't prevent it, because the fundamental economics haven't changed. Empire costs more than it generates, always. Britain couldn't escape this reality. Neither can China. China's reserves won't last forever, already declining. China's currency control creates other problems: capital flight, black markets. China's nuclear weapons don't prevent debt defaults in Pakistan or protests in Africa. The advantages buy time. They don't change the outcome. Britain's empire collapsed over 20 years, 1945 to 1965. How long will China's Belt and Road empire last? It's already contracting. Lending peaked in 2016, now down 95%. So the collapse has already begun. Prediction: by 2035, Belt and Road will be mostly abandoned. A few core projects in Pakistan, Central Asia might survive. But Africa, Latin America, most of Asia, China will withdraw. Not through dramatic announcements, through quiet non-renewal of projects. Countries will default, China will write off loans, projects will be abandoned. And China will call it successful completion or strategic adjustment. Just like Britain called its retreat granting independence to prepare nations for self-governance. Same outcome, different branding. 20 years, 2016 to 2036. China's Belt and Road empire will collapse in the same timeframe Britain's formal empire did?
What does China's imperial collapse mean for the world? First, developing countries will be left with debt and incomplete infrastructure. Railways to nowhere, ports without traffic, power plants that don't generate enough revenue. Just like British colonies were left with administrative systems designed for empire, not independent nations. The infrastructure won't serve local needs. It was designed to serve Chinese interests. Second, political instability in countries that depended on Chinese investment. Pakistan's economy will crisis without Chinese funding. African nations will struggle with debt and incomplete projects. Central Asian states will have to reorient toward Russia or the West. Geopolitical realignment. Third, China will focus inward. Domestic economic reform, addressing debt, demographics, unemployment. Less global ambition, more defensive posture. Like Britain after decolonization, a middle power, not a global hegemon.
Who wins from China's imperial collapse? The United States, just like America won from British collapse. As China retreats, American influence fills the vacuum. American loans replace Chinese loans. American companies replace Chinese companies. The dollar strengthens as Belt and Road fails. American alliances, NATO, AUKUS, Indo-Pacific partnerships, grow stronger. This isn't American victory through strength. It's American victory through Chinese failure. Just like the Cold War, America didn't defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed. America won't defeat China. China will collapse under the weight of its own imperial ambitions. Who loses? Developing countries trapped in Chinese debt. They borrowed for infrastructure, got incomplete projects and unpayable loans. China will write off loans, but demand strategic concessions, ports, resources, political alignment.
the poorest countries pay the highest price, just like after British Empire collapsed.
Could China have avoided this outcome? Could Belt and Road have worked? Only if China had learned from Britain's mistakes. Britain's mistake, building empire faster than the economy could sustain it. China's mistake? Same thing. Britain's mistake, investing in colonies without ensuring profitability. China's mistake? Same thing. Britain's mistake, ignoring nationalist resistance until too late. China's mistake? Same thing. If China had built Belt and Road slowly, carefully, ensuring projects were profitable, respecting local concerns, building genuine partnerships instead of dependencies, maybe it could have worked. But that's not what China did. China rushed, built massive projects on debt, created resentment through heavy-handed tactics. The same mistakes Britain made, and they're producing the same results.
The deepest irony. China studied the British Empire's fall. Chinese historians wrote extensively about why Britain's empire collapsed. Chinese strategists understood the economic, political, and military factors. And yet China built Belt and Road, a system with the exact same structural flaws. Why? Because empires are seductive. The prestige, the influence, the vision of reshaping the world. Every rising power thinks, we'll do it better. We'll avoid the mistakes of the past. Spain thought this. France thought this. Britain thought this. The Soviet Union thought this. All failed. All discovered the same truth. Empire costs more than it generates. Always. China is learning this lesson now. The hard way. Just like every empire before it. Let's examine China's debt crisis more closely, because this is the mechanism of collapse. China's total debt, over 300% of GDP. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt. Local governments, bankrupt. Over $9 trillion in hidden debt. Property developers, defaulting. Evergrande, Country Garden, dozens more. Banks, holding massive non-performing loans. This is exactly Britain in 1945. Debt accumulated faster than economic growth, became unsustainable. For Britain, the trigger was World War II exhaustion. For China, the trigger is demographic decline plus economic slowdown. Different triggers, same outcome. Debt becomes unpayable. Government must choose priorities. Britain chose domestic needs over empire. China is choosing domestic stability over Belt and Road. The mathematics are inexorable. China's demographics are worse than Britain's were. Britain in 1945, young population, post-war baby boom coming. China in 2025, aging rapidly, population declining, fewer workers, more retirees. By 2050, China will have 400 million people over 60. Who pays for their retirement, their health care? A shrinking workforce supporting a massive elderly population. This is catastrophic for imperial ambitions, because empire requires surplus resources, young workers generating wealth to invest abroad. Britain had this in the 1800s, surplus population emigrating to colonies, surplus capital investing globally. China has the opposite. Capital needed domestically, workers needed to support aging population. No surplus for empire. This alone would force Belt and Road's collapse. Combined with debt, collapse is guaranteed. Britain lost technology leadership to America and Germany. By 1945, American technology was superior, American industry more efficient. Britain couldn't compete. China faces a similar challenge. America, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all technologically advanced. China excelled at copying and manufacturing, but innovation? Semiconductor technology? China behind by generations. Artificial intelligence?
Chinese models lag American models. Green technology? Europe and America leading. China's tech companies facing sanctions, export controls, restrictions. Just like Britain faced American economic competition after World War II. Without technology leadership, China can't maintain economic dominance. Without economic dominance, China can't afford empire. The technology gap accelerates imperial decline. China's property sector is imploding. 70% of Chinese household wealth is in property. Property prices falling, developers defaulting, construction halting. This is wiping out Chinese middle-class wealth. Households that felt secure are now underwater on mortgages. Savings evaporated, retirement plans destroyed. This creates massive political pressure. Chinese citizens demanding government action, bailouts, support. Government must choose: rescue domestic property sector or fund Belt and Road. Obviously, they choose domestic. Belt and Road lending drops to nearly zero. This is identical to Britain's choice after World War II. Rescue domestic economy or maintain empire. Empire always loses this contest, because governments answer to domestic populations first.
Let's examine Pakistan, the centerpiece of Belt and Road. China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, $62 billion committed. Roads, railways, ports, power plants. Supposed to transform Pakistan into a prosperous Chinese ally. What actually happened? Pakistan now owes China over $30 billion. Cannot repay. Economy in crisis. Currency collapsing. Gwadar Port, built with Chinese loans, sits mostly empty. No traffic, no revenue. Power plants produce expensive electricity Pakistan can't afford. Railways incomplete. Projects abandoned. And Pakistani public opinion turning against China. Protests, attacks on Chinese workers, resentment of Chinese influence. This is exactly what happened to British India. Massive British investment, infrastructure built to serve British interests, not Indian needs. Rising nationalist resentment, economic burden on the colony. Eventually, unsustainable. Britain withdrew. China is withdrawing from Pakistan. Slowly, quietly, inevitably.
Sri Lanka, even more dramatic. Hambantota Port, built with Chinese loans, $1.5 billion. Sri Lanka couldn't repay. 2017, Sri Lanka handed the port to China on a 99-year lease. This looked like Chinese victory, debt trap diplomacy succeeding. But look closer. The port doesn't make money, even under Chinese control. Location wrong, insufficient traffic, operating at massive loss. China now owns a loss-making asset it can't sell. And Sri Lankan public, furious, see it as colonialism. Anti-Chinese protests, political crisis, government that made the deal overthrown. China's victory created political instability and a financial black hole. This is how Britain's empire failed. Short-term control, long-term unsustainability.
Africa, Belt and Road's largest footprint. Infrastructure everywhere. Railways in Kenya, ports in Djibouti, roads in Ethiopia, power plants in Zimbabwe. Total, over $150 billion lent since 2000. Now, defaults spreading. Zambia defaulted, Ethiopia restructuring debt, Kenya struggling with railway debt. Angola, Republic of Congo, Cameroon, all negotiating debt relief. China forced to write off billions. And African public opinion shifting. Labor practices criticized, environmental damage resented, debt burden opposed. China facing what Britain faced in Africa in the 1950s. Colonial model unsustainable. Local population demanding change. Economic burden exceeding strategic value. China is quietly reducing African commitments. Fewer new loans, more debt forgiveness. Belt and Road retreating from Africa, just like Britain did 60 years ago.
Southeast Asia, China's backyard.
should be easiest to control: geographic proximity, economic ties, historical influence. But even here, Belt and Road is failing. Malaysia canceled $22 billion in Chinese projects. Too expensive, too much debt. Myanmar canceled Myitsone Dam, local opposition, environmental concerns. Thailand delayed high-speed rail project, reduced Chinese involvement. Indonesia renegotiated terms, demanded more local participation. Vietnam rejected Chinese loans, chose Japanese financing instead. Even Cambodia, China's closest Southeast Asian ally, is diversifying, seeking non-Chinese investment. Why? Because these countries watched Pakistan and Sri Lanka, saw debt traps, saw economic disasters, saw political backlash. They learned. China's empire is failing even in its own sphere of influence. Just like Britain couldn't maintain control over nearby Ireland. If you can't control your backyard, you can't control a global empire.
Will China's empire collapse the same way Britain's did? Yes, it already is. The patterns are identical. Economic overextension? Check. Unsustainable debt? Check. Nationalist resistance? Check. Domestic crisis forcing retreat? Check. Great power competition accelerating decline? Check. Every factor that destroyed Britain's empire is present in China's Belt and Road. The timeline might differ, the mechanisms might vary slightly, but the outcome is the same. Empires built on debt and economic coercion collapse when the economics fail. Britain learned this in 1945 to 1965. China is learning it now. Why does this matter? Because imperial collapse creates global instability. British decolonization created partition of India, millions dead. Middle East conflicts, still ongoing. African instability, decades of civil wars. Cold War power vacuum, Soviet expansion. Chinese Belt and Road collapse will create debt crises across developing world, political instability in client states, great power competition for influence, potential conflicts over abandoned projects. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. We're watching the collapse of an empire in real time, just like our grandparents watched British Empire collapse. The consequences will shape the world for decades. What lessons should we learn? First, empire is always temporary. Every empire thinks it's different. Every empire is wrong. Spain, France, Britain, Soviet Union, now China, all discovered the same truth. Empire costs more than it generates. Second, debt-fueled expansion is unsustainable. Whether it's British war debt or Chinese Belt and Road debt, eventually, the debt must be repaid or written off. Either way, empire ends. Third, nationalism always defeats imperialism. People want self-determination. They resist foreign control. This was true in British India. It's true in Pakistan today. Fourth, domestic needs trump foreign ambitions. When governments must choose, they choose their own citizens. Britain chose British welfare over empire. China is choosing Chinese stability over Belt and Road. Fifth, economic laws are universal. Gravity affects everyone. So does economic reality. You can't spend more than you have forever. Not even empires.
What happens to China after Belt and Road collapses? Same thing that happened to Britain. Retreat, retrenchment, focus on core interests. China will remain a major power, just like Britain remained important after decolonization. But not a global hegemon, not an empire. A large, important country focused on its own region and domestic development. The Chinese century will end before it really began. Just like the British century ended in 1945, despite Britain being on the winning side. This isn't China's defeat. It's reality reasserting itself. Empires rise, empires overextend, empires collapse. The cycle is eternal.
Where does this leave America? In the same position America occupied in 1945, benefiting from a rival empire's collapse without causing it. America didn't destroy the British Empire. Britain's economics did. America isn't destroying Belt and Road. China's economics are. But America benefits either way. As China retreats, American influence expands. Not through American expansion, through Chinese contraction. The vacuum fills itself. However, America should remember, Britain thought its empire was permanent. It wasn't. America thinks its hegemony is sustainable. Maybe it isn't. Every empire believes it's different. None are. The lessons of British and Chinese imperial collapse apply to everyone, including America.
Step back. Look at the bigger pattern. Spain built an empire on New World gold, went bankrupt. France built an empire through military conquest, couldn't sustain it. Britain built an empire on trade and industry, collapsed in debt. Soviet Union built an empire on ideology. Economics destroyed it. China built an empire on infrastructure debt, now collapsing. Every method fails. Every empire falls. Why? Because empire is fundamentally inefficient. It costs more to control people than they generate in value. This has been true throughout history. It's still true today. China is just the latest to learn this lesson. It won't be the last.
Final comparison. Britain and China side by side. Britain 1920. Empire at peak. 458 million subjects. China 2013. Belt and Road launched. 150 plus countries. Britain 1945. Financially exhausted. Can't afford empire. China 2025. Debt crisis. Can't afford Belt and Road. Britain 1947. India independent. Empire collapsing. China 2019. Belt and Road lending collapses 95%. Britain 1965. Empire mostly gone. China 2035. Belt and Road will be mostly abandoned. 45 years for Britain. 20 years for China. Faster collapse. Same pattern. Because China's debt accumulated faster. Demographics worse. Global competition more intense. But the story is identical. Empire, overextension, economic crisis, retreat. History repeating.
And the human cost? British imperial collapse caused enormous suffering. Partition of India? 2 million dead, 15 million displaced. Colonial wars? Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus, hundreds of thousands killed. Economic disruption? Newly independent nations struggling. Chinese Belt and Road collapse will cause suffering too. Debt defaults? Governments bankrupted, services cut, people suffer. Incomplete projects? Billions wasted, infrastructure to nowhere. Political instability? Governments falling, potential conflicts. The poorest countries will pay the highest price, just like after British Empire. Because empires extract wealth during expansion and leave debt during collapse. The imperial center, Britain or China, survives. The periphery suffers. This is the true cost of empire. Not just to the imperial power that collapses, but to everyone caught in the system.
Will China's empire collapse the same way Britain's did? Yes. Not because China is weak, because empire is impossible. Not because of American opposition, because of economic reality. Not because of moral failure, because of mathematical inevitability.
empire costs more than it generates. This was true in Rome, true in Spain, true in Britain. It's true in China. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's bid for global empire, is collapsing under its own weight. Just like the British Empire collapsed under its weight. The same pattern, the same outcome. 20 years from now, historians will write about China's Belt and Road the way we write about Britain's empire today. An ambitious project, impressive in scope, ultimately unsustainable. An empire that rose quickly and fell quickly. Because all empires fall. Always. China is not different. History is repeating, and we're watching it happen in real time.